The one group we hear more about than anyone else in the Bible, with the exception of the children of Israel, are the Pharisees. In your typical non-scholarly book, they are presented as hypocritical legalists who believe in the resurrection from the dead, with little other information provided. And in scholarly circles, there's a battle between those who want to straight up equate the first century Pharisees with the later rabbis and the much later Orthodox Jews, versus those who question exactly how much authority the Pharisees really had, and whether they all but died out in the post-70 AD world, gradually giving way to rabbinic thought that was influenced by the Pharisees, but in many ways is not even remotely the same, and certainly differs from modern Judaism, which takes many of its cues from the 12th century scholar Maimonides. In the Christian world, no one wants to be called a Pharisee. But, you may not know this, in modern Judaism, almost every group wants to be called the inheritors of the presumably deep roots of Pharisaic Judaism. I believe the truth lies somewhere between the extremes, and today we're going to talk about what we do and do not know about the Pharisees, what is presumed, and what is assumed based on text where they are probably being described, yet are not explicitly named. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome to Character in Context, where we explore the historical context of Scripture and talk about how it bears on our own behavior and witness as image bearers. You can find my teachings on my websites, theancientbridge.com and contextforkids.com, as well as on my YouTube channels, accessible from my websites. You can also access past broadcasts on my podcast channel, characterincontext.podbean.com. And my context books for adults and families are available through Amazon.com. Okay, now everyone wants deep roots, right? The more ancient your beliefs, the more legitimate they seem to modern people. We've all heard that the first pope of the Catholic Church was Peter, right? Despite the fact that the modern Roman Catholic Church as we know it wouldn't exist for many hundreds of years after his death, and there were certainly no popes in Peter's time. In the same way, the modern neo-pagan movement, which is just a couple hundred years old, has begged, borrowed, and stolen whatever they like from whoever they like, oftentimes based only on appearances. 19th century romantic literature, fairy tales, like the Grimm fairy tales, urban legends, and just about everything other than the archaeology and everything other than the actual religions that they represent. But they claim to be an ancient religion, despite a growing consensus among both scholars and New Agers that actually do their homework, that their religion is not only very new, but historically an inaccurate view of ancient paganism. It's a lifestyle. It's been developed for fun. And a lot of people are actually embracing that, including some friends of mine. Yeah, I've got friends who are Wiccans and all sorts of things back from 25, 30 years ago. Now, as with the Catholic claim of the first century popes, we have Wiccans and neo-pagans seeking out credibility through dubious or outright ridiculous ancient claims. But all such claims, including our own, have to be examined and should never be taken at face value. People are very sensitive about their religious views and are quick to believe anything that bolsters their own faith's credibility. And we all do it. I am not pointing fingers, at everyone else here. It's like this ginormous blind spot, this total pass that we tend to give ourselves, even while despising it and really recognizing it very clearly when other people are doing it. It's so easy to see other people's hypocrisy and blind spots, right? And be totally oblivious to our own. Aren't we just awful? It's it's really funny if we think about it. So, because of this deep roots mentality, we have this unfortunate tendency in many Christian and Messianic circles to presume that what we see in modern Judaism is a good and reliable roadmap of the first century, when nothing could be farther from the truth. First century Judaism revolved around the temple. Period. That was the center of their universe. And we can understand that. It was the dwelling place of God on earth and the center of his worship. The priests were powerful because they had a position of inherited responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that all priests were powerful, because many were just poor Judeans and Galileans who did their 2 weeks yearly, plus feasts, at the temple. But the highest ranking Jews, besides the Herods, of course, and we know that they weren't genetically Jews, they had been forcibly converted under the reign of, hope I get this right, John Hyrcanus, when he annexed Edom. And he forcibly converted the populace to Judaism. Of course, the Jews didn't really accept them as true Jews because they were forcibly. And the Herods with their behavior didn't really help, matters much. So the highest ranking Jews, like I said, besides the Herods, who were the, Roman appointed kings, were the high priestly family of Ananias or Ananias or Annas. You can find his name spelled differently in different sources, spelling things exactly the same way. Wasn't always, shall we say, highest priority in the ancient world. So they were the chief priests. Some of the family of Annas were the chief priests. Not all chief priests were from the family of Annas, but the high priests for many, many years were from his family. So under the high priestly family, we had the chief priests, who were responsible for the temple operations, and the aristocrats. Now, it's from these groups that Josephus says the Sadducees came from. Now, all of the chief priests and all the aristocrats were not Sadducees, but all Sadducees were from this upper class of people. Sadducees were a faction. Let's call them a faction. It's not exactly, it's more than a denomination, because in those days there was no separating politics from religion, and there was no compartmentalism at all. Excuse me. And so everything in their lives was completely one. You got your politics, you got your spirituality, and that's everybody in the ancient world, whether they were Jews or pagans or whatever. Same stuff. So, like I said, all of the chief priests were not Sadducees. The high priestly family was Sadducees, I believe, as far as we know. All of a sudden, I'm questioning myself. Josephus says that the Sadducees were from this group, and we can, instead of a faction, we can call it a sect. And it's Judaism. They were all upper class. Josephus said they were like only friends with the rich. They hated each other. They fought with each other. The Sadducees didn't even like each other. But below that on the social ladder, we have the retainers of the elites. The upper and middle level bureaucrats who worked in the service of the upper class. This is where we would mostly find the Scribes and the Pharisees, who were, by definition, educated. And we'll talk about them more later. Although people in the upper class could also be Pharisees, not everybody was a Sadducee in the upper class, like I was saying. They could be Pharisees, but that's what we're going to talk about today, where the Pharisees and Scribes fit into society, who they were, and how they fit into the Hellenistic Jewish world of the 200 years between the Pharisees first mentioned by Josephus in the court of John Hyrcanus, who was the son of Simon Maccabee, the last of the Maccabean brothers in the Maccabean revolt, to their really last pure champion of Eleazar ben Hyrcanus in the 1st and 2nd century before the movement gradually morphed into the rabbinic over the next few centuries. And it was not something that happened all at once, and we see from the arguments in the Mishnah and the Talmud that it took quite a while for rabbinic thought to become kind of solidified and to catch on. So I've done so much reading about this over the years, but for this teaching I splurged, and I bought 2 new books, which I read front to back because they were just so good. Now, the author's name of both is Anthony J. Saldarini. He was an amazingly balanced scholar. I really like this kind of guy. He's the guy who's able to look at the historical records and honestly say, it does say this and it doesn't say that unless you read it into it. You know, this might be true, but we can only say that if we assume X. A lot of people, even some scholars, don't know how to read a document without reading into it what they want to see. And this is something we all do. I'm not saying, I don't do this. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he wrote. And he did have one huge paradigm that I disagreed with, but all in all, he's the kind of scholar you want to read because he's just stinking honest. My new books from him are Pharisees, Scribes, and Sadducees in Palestinian Society and Matthew's Christian Jewish Community. I also supplemented his books with some articles by Jacob Neusner, and if you are reading an article of his on the subject of the Pharisees, make sure it is a later article because for a while he championed Morton Smith's debunked 1959 theory on the Pharisees, which Neusner later denounced based on evidence in other sources. Dead Sea Scrolls really opened some things up. Also, I read some stuff from Steve Mason, Lauren Schiffman, obviously Loeb's Josephus. That's the scholar's version of Josephus. It's like many volumes, but it's excellent. The Mishnah and the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. Okay, so who were the Pharisees anyway? As I mentioned last week or next week, as I'm inserting this teaching into the middle of the series after I realized I'd skipped a step, Josephus mentioned 4 Pharisees. I hope I'm saying that right. Pharisees. I went on, you can go on YouTube and you say how to pronounce a certain Greek word and it'll have somebody say it to you and you could practice over and over again. And I still get it wrong the first time I do it. So 4 Pharisees, or philosophies within Judaism: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and the quote-unquote 4th philosophy of the revolutionaries. We would call the 4th philosophy zealots. Philosophy in Hellenistic times was a way of thinking and a way of life, a way to practice virtue and to shun evil. In light of this definition, Josephus was right to call these competing factions or sects of Judaism philosophies, as we would have to admit that Catholicism, Protestantism, Pentecostalism, and Messianism are all philosophies of Christianity, which in turn started out as a philosophy of ancient Judaism and remained so for hundreds of years. We might call Phariseeism a sect, not in terms of an inclusive cult or a seclusive cult. Let's call it seclusive. As moderns, we generally imagine when we hear that word, but a voluntary grouping of like-minded people who have certain goals and ideas that they would like everyone to follow for the good of society. That was the nature of ancient philosophy. The Pharisees wanted everyone to agree with them. Shock, it's like, don't we all? We got our philosophies. They wanted everyone to agree with them and live according to their ways. And so did the Essenes and the Zealots. And, the Zealots wanted everyone to revolt against Rome, and the Sadducees really only cared about the rich. And, even they fought bitterly with each other, and I don't think they cared if anyone lived according to their ways. Now, a sect is never the main whole group. So Judaism itself would not be a sect. Modern sects of Judaism would be the Hasid, the Orthodox, Reform, and the Karaites. But in the first century world, there was no separation of religion and politics. In fact, no one compartmentalized anything. There was no politics without religion or religion without politics. There was no area of life that religion didn't enter into, regardless of whether you were a Jew or a pagan. So that's really different with them. It was all part and parcel. Your gods were involved in your politics, and your politics were involved with your gods. Pure and simple. Now, throughout the Wars of the Jews and Antiquities, book 13 through 18, and Life, those are 3 of Josephus's works, Josephus repeatedly points to the Pharisees as being enormously popular with the common people, and that ritual and social life among the Jews was lived according to their standards. But he also points to them as being power-hungry and hypocritical. Now, you gotta know that Josephus said that he was a Pharisee, and at least in his youth he was. He writes about them, he'll say great things about them, and then he'll just say, but these guys. So get prepared, because he's going to yo-yo. All right? But Josephus had this paradigm, and this is why the yo-yo. We all have our agendas, right? He had this paradigm that stability is always good and chaos is always bad. It's actually a very legitimate way of thinking in the ancient world, where chaos meant death, disease, enslavement, loss of inheritance, and worse. It didn't just mean a peaceful exchange of power as we know it in the West. So for Josephus, a stable ruler and a government shouldn't be messed with, even if it was a foreign ruler, as long as everything was kind of running smoothly. The people weren't being slaughtered. And there wasn't war. Governments, in Josephus's ideas, should not be toppled lightly unless there was no alternative. He speaks ill of anyone who threatens the peace, and during Hasmonean times, and especially during the reign of Salome Alexander, the Pharisees sometimes showed themselves to be a power-grasping, murderous, vengeful group who would, out of one side of their mouth, prophesy, good for Herod, while plotting with other members of his family to overthrow him out of the other side of their mouth. So Josephus, who called himself a Pharisee, approved of their way of life and considered it the proper interpretation of Judaism. But he considered the Pharisees themselves to not live up to their own standards, and these are his words. And they kind of sound familiar if we've gone through the woes, as that's the series that I'm doing right now. Yeshua said that. Yeshua said, they did not do what they preached. Josephus said the same thing many, many years later. Josephus was actually born after the death of Yeshua at about, I think at 37 AD. So he's got to be a pretty good source on the Pharisees. Now, so they had the right interpretation according to Josephus, but their political agendas, in his view, were dangerous. Now, it's safe to say that Josephus had a real love-hate relationship with them, but this is often the case within sects, where people who agree are often the harshest critics within their own movement. And I need to say right now that during the Hasmonean and times of the Herods, he was very much correct about the power grasping of the Pharisees during that epoch. During the time the Gospels were written, the Pharisees really, really practiced a live and let live approach. They had lost the power that they'd had earlier in Hasmonean times and under the Herods, and they were really just a faction that was kind of pushed to the side as far as politics goes. So a lot of the stuff Josephus says isn't going to apply to the gospel times. But he's also, writing about them after that time too. So, in all, when we read the Gospels, we're tempted to think there were a lot of Pharisees, like there were one on every street corner. But really, Josephus said there were about 6,000. 6,000 Pharisees. Tacitus, he said that there were 600,000 people altogether living in Jerusalem at the fall in 70 AD. And Josephus claimed that 1.1 million were killed, because the whole revolt thing happened at Passover, and that 97,000 were enslaved. And of course, not everybody was there. And so when you look at these huge numbers of how many people were actually living in the land, 6,000 guys is not much. And I actually did the maths. I gotta find it. I did the math. It was like not a lot of people. They made up such an incredibly small part of the population that their domination over social life and popularity can only be explained by the fact that they were educated in a time where the overwhelming majority were incredibly impoverished and uneducated and in need of popular champions. And the Pharisees, according to Josephus, filled that role for them. But what Josephus had to say was nothing compared to the vitriolic attack on the Pharisees by the Essenes. Those guys were downright hateful. As such, as they never said anything nice about anyone but themselves and were categorically opposed to anyone who wasn't an Essene, we have to be careful reading their material not to completely take it at face value unless we have some substantiation elsewhere. Just as we have to read Josephus through the eyes of somebody who hates political instability and adjust our perceptions accordingly. We have to weigh inherent sectarian prejudice against outsiders when we're looking at the Essenes, because dang, they said rude, nasty things about everyone. Now, if scholars are right, and the Pharisees are the ones to whom the Essenes attribute the title Ephraim, and that would make the Sadducees Manasseh, the ones who, quote-unquote, control Israel, according to Essenes, which would make sense. Then the Damascus document found near Qumran portrays the Pharisees as the builders of the wall, perhaps a reference to their command to build fences around the Torah, which we find in Avot 1:1. And they are specifically called out for by the Essenes, among other things, promoting marriage to one's niece and polygamy, both of which are permitted and even promoted in later rabbinic texts. So remember when I said we need outside verification that, just because they say Ephraim as opposed to Manasseh, and Manasseh is obviously the Sadducees, it doesn't mean that Ephraim's the Pharisees. We've got to look for other clues. And the other clues are looking at other documents and saying, okay, the Essenes say they believed this, and here, this document here says they believe this too. So that really helps us out. I got a minute before the break, so I'm not going to get into the really nasty stuff that we're going to talk about in the next half hour. Oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe the stuff that these Essenes say. But, as we were talking about probably last week, polemic. You get polemic between sects. All the different sects were saying, we've got the right way, listen to us, don't listen to those guys, they're scruffy-looking nerf herders. They're not trustworthy, they don't practice what they preach, they're horrible excuses for human beings, they misrepresent God, they're hypocrites, they're this, they're that, they're all the other things. That was the way of the world. This is how people talked about one another. And that was the ancient world. That was Hellenism. That is what we see throughout the Hellenistic world is you don't just debate with your rivals. Man, you got to undermine them. It's not really the kind of behavior that Yeshua promoted in his disciples when he told us to be meek and stuff. I'll be right back. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome back to the second half of Character and Context, where I had to leave off before getting to the real juicy stuff that the Essenes said about, we believe, the Pharisees. And I explained in the last half why we believe that the Pharisees are the ones who are described by the Essenes as Ephraim, and we believe they described the Sadducees with the name Manasseh. So we're gonna remember what I said. They called them the builders of the wall, and of course in Avot 1:1 we see the command to build fences around the Torah. And then they described some specific views that we know that the Pharisees had during those times. So, notably, marriage to one's niece. I know, it just kind of like, ugh. And polygamy. Although there's no evidence they really practiced it, but they promoted it. And they actually decided that marriage to one's niece was actually a virtue, which bothers my modern sensibilities more than you can possibly imagine. Now, the Essenes describe the Pharisees as the spinners of spiders' webs, despisers of God, who have separated from true Judaism. Let's see, Josephus wouldn't agree with that. He thought that the Pharisees had the right interpretation, that they're hated by God. Now, this is back to the Essenes. That quote-unquote Ephraim is hated by God and responsible for God's anger against his people, following false teachers, and therefore not understanding the truth that the Essenes knew. Other scrolls prophesy, and I'm reading here from Lauren Schiffman's excellent article, The Pharisees and Their Legal Traditions According to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you thought my book titles were long. And this is on page 266, that they would be destroyed by the quote-unquote last prince, that they have removed God's boundaries by teaching false things, that they speak rebelliously against God's laws, they prophesy deceit, and they cause Israel to go astray. They are expounders of false laws, etc., 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 and have, as a teacher, the man they call the man of lies, as opposed to the Essenes teacher, who was the teacher of righteousness. Isn't that just typical? Do we ever change? Oh, my teacher's just great. My favorite one. Oh, we're going to do a little, get on a little tangent here. My absolute favorite thing is when people tell me that I believe somebody because I'm listening to men and not God, and then they say, why don't you listen to my teacher? And I'm going, is your teacher not a man? Oh, yeah, but he hears from God. You know, it just not when my teacher hears from God, when my teacher really does hear from God, when my teacher hears from God and not men, it's, yeah. Never mind, I'm just totally, this stuff gets me all convoluted. So, you know, there's all that. But no one ever called the Essenes a bunch of nice guys after reading enough of their writings. So we can't take what they write and say, yep, those Pharisees were devil in disguise. Like last week when we talked about polemic in the ancient world, this was how philosophical opponents talked about one another. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. It's kind of like, how come when I'm listening to men, I'm listening to men? And how come when you're listening to a man, you're really listening to God? We're horrible. Our own hypocrisy is only ever obvious to everyone else. All right, so back to this. Now, how about the Bible? The Bible presents the Pharisees as, one, educated, right? Can't argue with that. Two, primarily linked to Jerusalem. They keep saying, Pharisees came down from Jerusalem, that kind of thing. Three, active in the synagogues. 4, concerned with Sabbath observances, purity concerns, tithing, and divorce. And 5, the newfangled belief in the resurrection of the dead and the world to come and angels. And when I say newfangled, I say that because ancient Judaism, I mean, you can't find it in the scriptures unless you read it into it. And I'm not saying it can't be read into it, but I'm saying that you don't see them talking about the world to come in the Hebrew scriptures. You only see that starting to enter into the picture in Hellenistic times, actually. So it's interesting. So anyway, okay. The Bible, the Gospels, absolutely presents them as some sort of loosely based voluntary association. We see nothing here or in any documents about educational requirements for being a Pharisee, what their personal backgrounds were, what their membership requirements were, etc. We don't know about their leadership beyond later rabbinic stories about Hillel and Shammai, who, and this surprised me when I found this, Hillel and Shammai are not mentioned in any historical documents that I know of that have been found yet, until later rabbinic Jewish writings. That being said, we have no doubt to doubt their existence because too much of what is said in the timeline lines up. So I'm not doubting the existence of Hillel and Shammai. I teach about Hillel and Shammai. So I'm just saying that it's weird that they're not mentioned anywhere else, except for, hundreds of years after their death. So there's also nothing about how a person became a Pharisee. We have only a very few rulings attributed to them in the Bible, as well as some others in the Talmud recorded much later. Of course, the first part of the Talmud to be codified was the Mishnah in about 200 of the Common Era, and then later the rest of the Talmud was codified in like 600. Okay? So, and this is a lot of years after. Now, we don't know if all the Pharisees were well off, although we suspect that they had a good chance of being well off because it takes an education in order to study, and even to have access to the Torah scrolls and leisure to learn beyond simple synagogue attendance. Now, a poor man, unless he was working miracles like Yeshua or a Hasid like Honi the circle drawer, which is a really cool guy, look him up, wasn't going to be given any attention. Of course, the most famous Pharisees in the Bible were Gamaliel and Paul. In Acts 15:5, we see Pharisees counted among the believers of Yeshua and appearing as witnesses or petitioners before the council. So the typical Pharisees were obviously well-placed socially, at least usually. They had time to study, leisure to travel and investigate an upstart Galilean. They could read and write, which would make them valuable as retainers of the upper class. Likely many of them worked as counselors, scribes, bureaucrats for the temple and perhaps for the Romans, with whom they practiced a policy of getting along wherever they could. They could be judges and other administrative types of people and be Pharisees. I can say obviously because there was no middle class in the Roman Empire, so it's not like they could be middle class people and sort of well off. You were either poor or you had money. There really wasn't anything in between. Excuse me. Now, there were people who had money and those who did not. The poor were insanely poor. They made up the bulk of the Roman Empire, and especially in a place like Judea, which was nearly on the border with the Parthian Empire, which Rome often fought but was never able to defeat. So the Pharisees offered the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, a way to live out their identity as Jews with pride despite their poverty. Although many of their legislations were somewhat oppressive, like the Hillelite ruling giving any man the right to leave his wife for any reason he wanted, and directives to tithe absolutely everything when they were already struggling to get by under the oppressive Roman taxes. Most of the boundary setting regulations in existence at that time were probably doable. Boundary setting is something that we see in every culture. It marks off us from them. For the Jews, their most notable boundary markers were things like circumcision, the Shema, tassels on their garments, and not eating unclean animals. These had just become incredibly important to the Jews after the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, when things like circumcision were outlawed and even punishable by death. It wasn't just a commandment anymore, but a marker of who was and was not Jewish, who was and was not worthy. For a group to come along and give them pride in being Jews, I'm talking about the poor here, to give the poor pride in being Jews under Roman occupation, to teach them how to live set-apart lives without having to be scholars themselves, that was a powerful force in favor of the Pharisees. Josephus, I forgot to mention earlier, made a point of saying how the Pharisees actively cultivated good relationships with the villagers and the citizens of Roman-occupied Judea, Galilee, Perea, and Transjordan. As they were educated in that culture, it's likely that they served as go-betweens, mediators, and patrons of the lower class. We'll talk about patrons some other time. Sorry, this is the allergy time of year. So in those days, formal synagogues were still very rare in the land, and so it is very possible that services were held in the courtyards of local Pharisees or other wealthier citizens. That would foster a tremendous amount of goodwill, but it is also speculation on my part. Just being honest here. Josephus pointed out that the Pharisees were so well liked by the populace that all they had to do was slander someone, even the king or the high priest, and they would immediately be believed. That's some serious credibility. So when John the Baptist and Yeshua both launched polemic attacks against these guys, the Jerusalem audience would have been astounded. Despite the Galilean villagers already having come to respect Yeshua by seeing his miracles, teachings, and victories in his verbal battles, with the Pharisees, the Judeans still would have had tremendous respect for the Pharisees. Yeshua was not a local, and in the Synoptic Gospels, he never even shows up in Jerusalem until that final Passover. John records other brief visits, but no serious extended ministry work in Judea. So the Pharisees were there, Yeshua wasn't. They were there all the time, Yeshua wasn't. It's like, well, what have you done for us today? And these were the guys who were doing things for people every day, the Pharisees. So although Yeshua was only attacking a group of about 6,000 among millions of Jews in the land, he really was attacking the popular kids who had completely ingratiated themselves to the quote-unquote little people. Being mostly only bureaucrats and the retainers of the wealthy, they didn't have any real political power of their own except through their upper-class patrons. In other words, any power that they had in the first century was only by proxy, on behalf of their more powerful and potentially aristocratic employers or through their influences on the masses, on the lower class. But on their own, they had no political power to speak of, ever since they fell out of favor with the Herods. All four Gospels prove this out. When the high priest and the chief priests and elders are the only ones who have Yeshua arrested and tried, the Pharisees are never mentioned in any of the accounts as having been part of that. Now, how were they different from later rabbis? Well, one, because no one was called a rabbi during those years as a title. And in the Talmud, the sages are never called rabbis. And the sages are the people like Hillel, Shammai, the great Jewish minds of that time who handed down rulings. If we look at two men who lived at the same time, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Yohanan ben Zakkai, we see the former as clearly a classic Pharisee and the second as the or one of the leads of the emerging rabbinic movement of the 2nd century. Of the rulings of theirs preserved in the Talmud, we see Eliezer concerned with classic Pharisee concerns: ritual purity, tithing, and Sabbath observance. His rulings reflect a desire to continue life as it was in the times before the destruction of the temple, with the clear belief that it would be rebuilt shortly, just as was the case with the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of Nehemiah's temple. His aim was to preserve the established way of life so everything could resume as before the disaster. Just a little more pharisaically. He liked his order. He did. He had as his goal the continuation of Jewish life as a Pharisaic institution. Yohanan was very different. Yohanan was actually Eliezer's teacher, so there's a lot of overlap here. Yohanan was different in that he was more interested in establishing a post-temple way of life, where the authority of the priest was now subordinated to the new class of rabbis, and new laws and doctrines were enacted in order to compensate for the loss of the temple. I mean, what are we supposed to do on Shavuot when the only thing that they ever did was march to Jerusalem and present their first fruits? And you can't do that anymore. So they had to come up with new ways of living post-temple where they could still honor God's laws. Okay, now Zaccai's reforms did not happen overnight, and reading the Talmudic and other writings shows us there were some very profound arguments and disagreements over the next few hundred years as the rabbinic movement finally won and their ways became normalized for Judaism. If first century Judaism was already successfully rabbinic by virtue of the Pharisees already practicing rabbinic Judaism, then there would have been very little struggle. And more, Eliezer would have never been excommunicated for disagreeing with the majority, which is a major rabbinic tenet. You incline towards the majority. You don't go against the majority, no matter what, even if it disagrees with the Bible. Now, the Pharisees were similar to the later rabbis, but they never carried the authority, organization, and never had the power to rule over the masses. Remember, the Pharisees just influenced them, and especially not in the diaspora, in the areas outside the land. What the later rabbis accomplished has to be admired no matter who you are. It was a stunning achievement, but it doesn't represent what Judaism looked like in Yeshua's lifetime, nor especially the modern Karaite movement does not. Because it just doesn't. According to Josephus and according to the other commentators, it just doesn't. I don't want to talk about that right now. Worms! Okay. Now, the flip side of all this is the scribes, who we see sometimes associated with the Pharisees, other times with the chief priests, and sometimes on their own. Whereas the Pharisees were a sect, a belief, a voluntary organization based on shared vision and common beliefs and goals for society, the scribes were a professional class, so the scribes was a job. And it's likely that many were hereditary from scribal families who trained up their sons in the trade. We see scribes throughout the Bible. Baruch, for example, he was Jeremiah's scribe. A modern term might be secretary, but only in the larger meaning where secretaries aren't just the people who take dictation, but also legal experts who drop documents, translate, serve in the judiciary, maintain government posts. It's like the Secretary of the Defense. So secretary can mean a whole lot of different things, but it's all kind of the same thing. That would be like scribe. In that time, a scribe could also mean an expert in and teacher of the law, the Torah. Like the Pharisees, they would be part of the retainer class, employees of the wealthy and powerful, but some scribes were simply low-level village administrators, people who could read and write and draw basic contracts. And based on the spelling mistakes seen in a lot of the documents gathered from that area, scribes in these outlying areas weren't always high quality. So, and they didn't have any spell checks, so let's go easy on them, okay? Could you imagine having to write the whole document over again? So, what do we know about the scribes from the New Testament? Matthew mentions them 22 times, and the first mention is of them being consulted by Herod in chapter 2, verse 4, as to the arrival of the Messiah. These are all going to be Matthew citations here. So they were obviously serving as counselors and experts in the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew 7:29 is the famous remark about Yeshua teaching by his own authority and not as the scribes do. So obviously, scribes are teachers. It says it's right there. In Talmudic and other Jewish writings, we see that such and such taught in the name of such and such. They derived authority for their teachings by it formerly being taught by someone else, sort of like the two-witness rule. I liken it to saying, hey, it's not just me saying this, I got it from such and such. Okay? Credibility. But Yeshua does no such thing in Matthew 8:19. A scribe wants to follow him, and in 13:52, Yeshua talks about the value of scribes who are trained for the kingdom of heaven. In other places, we see them linked with the Pharisees, and most especially, like we've been discussing, in the Matthew 23 woes, and we'll be discussing them more over the weeks to come. Yeshua marks out the scribes and chief priests as those who will condemn him to death in Matthew 20:18, and the scribes are listed among those who do condemn him in 26:57 and mock him around the cross in 27:41. Mark 2:16 is where we see the phrase scribes of the Pharisees, clearly showing that not all Pharisees are scribes, yet some scribes are Pharisees. Josephus mentioned that many of the scribes shared a lot of beliefs in common with the Pharisees, and we see this validated when they ask about Yeshua's practice of eating with sinners, serious concern of the Pharisees in general. In Mark 7:1, we see that the scribes came down from Jerusalem with the Pharisees and joined them in questioning Yeshua in a dispute about traditional hand washing. Yeshua addressed both groups and rebukes them for some of their traditions that oppress others, blatantly breaking commandments in the process, while refusing to discuss their hand-washing tradition at all. In Mark 9:11, Yeshua is asked about the scribal teaching about Elijah coming before the Messiah. Again, scribes are teachers. In Mark 12, impressed by Yeshua's answers, a scribe asks him about the greatest commandment and compliments him on his answer, deferring to him as teacher. That's important. He deferred to him. For the rest of the gospel, the scribes are implicit in the plot to arrest and kill him, along with the chief priests, while again the Pharisees are never mentioned or implicated in any way. So these would be the scribes of the chief priest and not the scribes of the Pharisees. Mark mentions scribes 21 times. In Luke, the scribes are mentioned 14 times. Sometimes with the Pharisees, sometimes with the chief priests and elders, and sometimes alone. I'm only going to talk about new situations and not rehash what we see in the other Gospels. In 6:7, we see them pairing up with the Pharisees to see if they can accuse him about some sort of Sabbath violation. Luke 20, after the infamous confrontation with the Sadducees about the barren woman married 7 times, some of the scribes verbally commend him on the answer. Obviously, these were more likely Pharisaic scribes, as the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection or the world to come. Many of the appearances of the scribes in this gospel have to do with their role in the trial of Yeshua again. In the Gospel of John, they're only mentioned once, and that is when they and the Pharisees haul the adulterous woman before Yeshua in order to test him. Now, scribes are also referred to in certain situations by the term lawyers and teachers of the law, which meant pretty much the same thing. Don't think of Perry Mason or Matlock when you hear the word lawyer. This was a teacher of the law. This wasn't somebody who is an advocate. It's completely different. Likely the Pharisees would serve in roles as advocates of lower people going before higher people and seeking favor, that sort of thing, but didn't really have that in the Sanhedrin court. Oh my gosh. So we got to wrap it up here. This is longer than I thought. So really, when we look at what Judaism morphed into in the centuries after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis of later centuries were really more like scribes in some ways than just Pharisees. Teachers became a formal power class within Judaism to whom even the priests were subject. And that wasn't the case in the first century. That was not even remotely the case in the first century, as Josephus says. It was the Sadducees who came from the elite classes, and I haven't even talked about how awful they are, and I will not this week because, goodness gracious, That was a lot of stuff to fit in, and we are done. So anyway, thanks for joining me again today, and I hope you learned a lot. I hope it wasn't too confusing, and that was a lot of information. I apologize. And next week we will get back to the woes of Matthew 23.